All right, in section 3 here, we're going to do a process called factor by grouping. And here's how you're going to know that you're going to be using factor by grouping, is that you're going to be starting with 4 terms. Look at number 1. You have 4 terms here. You have the 12a to the third, you have minus 9a squared, you have plus 20a, you have minus 15. Those are your 4 terms you're going to be using to factor by grouping. Here's what you're going to do. First of all, now it says group the first 2 terms together. Here's one condition. Number 1, always start with the 4 terms in descending powers. You remember what that is? Descending powers of x. Meaning this, or a in this case, in number 1, we're talking about whatever the variable is, you want descending powers. And here's what that means by that. The highest exponent of a in this case needs to be first. The second highest next. Here's a and here's no a's. Look at number 2. You have h to the fourth, h to the third, h, and no h's. These are in descending orders because we're starting with the highest exponent first, and they're descending from there. In number 3, you have y to the fourth, you have y to the third, you have y to the squared, you have y to the first. These are in descending powers. So we've got to start with that. Then you are, like it says here, going to group the first 2 terms together, meaning use parentheses here. So I'm going to put parentheses around the 12a to the third minus 9a squared. Then I'm going to group the second 2 terms together, and I'm going to have 20a minus 15. Now let's just look at the first group, my first parentheses here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to be able to find the greatest common factor of those 2 terms. I'm just looking at this right here. The 12a to the third and minus the 9a squared. Just look at that parentheses and tell me what the greatest common factor is. Well, between 12 and 9, you have a 3. And between the a to the third and the a squared, you have a squared. Now, remember how we were factoring that out the last time? Was that we're going to have 3a squared times the quantity. Now, 12 divided by 3 is 4. A to the third over a squared is a. Bring down the minus sign. Do the same thing with the second one. 9 divided by 3 is 3, and the a squareds cancel. That's going to close. Then we're going to do the same thing with the second parentheses. What do we have in common here? Well, we have a 5 here and a 5 here. And when I factor out that 5, it's going to be plus 5. And then times the quantity. Now divide out the 5. You have 20 divided by 5 is 4. So we're going to have 4a. And then minus 3. Now if you'll notice, and we've already been doing part of this, look at this 4a minus 3 here. And the 4a minus 3 here. When those 2 things are the same, we're going to be able to factor that out. Remember what that's going to look like? Let's get rid of that mark. That 4a minus 3 is going to get pulled out, and what's going to be left over? The 3a squared plus 5. There's your final answer. And if we were to FOIL this, guess what we would come up with? These 4 terms. Number 2, I'm going to do the same thing. I already have them in descending powers, so I'm going to group the first 2 together. Now, between the 6 and the 4, what's in common? A 2. H to the fourth and h to the third. I'm going to have h to the third. Always a smaller exponent, right? So I'm going to have 2h to the third times the quantity. 6 divided by 2 is 3. H to the fourth over h to the third is h. Minus 4 over 2 is 2, and the h's are going to cancel. Group the second 2 together. Divide both sides by what? 4. And I'll have plus 4 times the quantity, 3h minus 2. And look at that again. The 3h minus 2 is the same as this 3h minus 2 here. And when we factor that out, what will we have left? 2h to the third plus 4. And there's your final answer. Number 3, go ahead and do on your own. Pause the video, see if you come up with the same thing I do. So pause this video right now and let's see what happens. Hopefully you came up with y minus 3 times the quantity 5y to the third plus y. Well, let's do the same thing with number 4. Go ahead and pause the video. And this one might be a little bit tricky, but see if you can come up with the right answer. If not, keep on playing the video. We're going to group the first two together. We're going to divide by 4x. That's the greatest common factor. So you're going to have 4x times the quantity, x squared plus 6. We're going to group the first two together, the last two together here. Now, what's in common between x squared and 6? Well, we only have a 1 in common, so we're going to write that 1 down times the quantity x squared plus 6. And when we factor out the x squared plus 6, when we pull that out, we're going to have 4x plus 1 left over. That one's a little bit of a tricky one. In number 5, I know we said we needed to start with descending powers. This one might be a little bit tricky, so because we have x's and y's. So let's just group the first two together and see what happens. So I'm going to group 8y minus 8 together. And what's in common here? An 8, right? So I'm going to have 8 times the quantity y minus 1. I'm going to group the second two together, and I can divide both of those by x. And I'll have y minus 1. Remember, any number divided by itself is 1 here. So we have that y minus 1 that's the same. So that y minus 1 times the quantity 8 plus x is what we have left over. Look at number 6. Very similar to what we just did in number 5. We're going to group these first two, and I'm going to have a 9x squared in common. So let's pull that out. And we have x plus 2 left over. Group the second two together, and I only have a 1 in common, but we still have to write it down. In this case, we're going to write down that 1. We have x plus 2 left over, and look at this. The x plus 2 is the same. We can bring that out. What do we have left over? 9x squared plus 1. Now remember, we do want descending powers when we can. The way this is written, it's not in descending powers. And this is going to be a little bit of a tricky one. I'm going to be starting with 3x to the third minus 15x squared. The next term will be minus 2x and then the plus 10. Does that make sense? So that we have let's do pink here. We have x to the third, x squared, x to the first. There are no x's there, so this is in descending powers. I'm going to group the first two terms together. So I'm going to put parentheses around the 3x to the third minus the 15x squared. I have a 3x squared in common. When I pull that out, I've got the 3x squared. Now, what's 3x to the third over 3x squared? It'll be x. Bring down the minus 5. 15 over 3 is 5. And the x squareds cancel. Here's another thing that we need to note. The middle sign needs to be a plus sign. So here's what I'm going to do here. That middle sign right there, I'm going to make it a plus, but if I do that, I have to make it a negative 2x. So it's just plus and negative, and you'll see why in just a second here. Because when I go to group my second two together like this, that 2x is what? Positive or negative? Well, it's negative, isn't it? Now, if we were to ignore that for just a second, just look at the 2x and the 10. What's the greatest common factor? 2, isn't it? So we're going to factor out the 2. But because it's now negative 2, I need to factor out the negative. So I'm going to bring down the greatest common factor, negative 2. Now, I'll open my parentheses. What's negative 2x divided by negative 2? Well, the negative 2's cancel, and you got x. Look at your second term. You have positive 10 over negative 2. What's 10 divided by negative 2? Negative 5. So now you have your x minus 5 and x minus 5. When you pull that out, you'll have 3x squared minus 2 left over. Now, that was a tough one. Makes sense that we would struggle with that one a little bit, but hopefully you'll see that when the first term of a in that parentheses, when the first number is negative, you're going to factor out the negative. All right, let's look at number 8. Again, we want to rewrite this so that it's in descending power. So the negative 10x to the third needs to come first. Plus 15x squared. Plus the 8x. And then the minus 12. Group the first two terms together. Now, between the 10 and the 15, what do we have in common? 5. Between x to the third and x squared, what do we have in common? X squared. And because the first term is negative, what do we need to factor out? Let's go ahead and factor out and make this, instead of 5x squared, just make it negative 5x squared. The greatest common factor you break down. You just bring it down and put it in front of your parentheses. It'll be negative 5x squared times the quantity. Now, just divide. What's negative 10x to the third divided by negative 5x squared? Well, negative 10 divided by negative 5 is positive 2. X to the third over x squared is x. What's 15 divided by negative 5? It's negative 3. What happens with the x squareds? They cancel. Now let's look at the second two. Let's group those together. What do you have in common? 4. So plus 4 times the quantity. 8x divided by 4 is 2x. Negative 12, or minus 12 over 4, would be minus 3. And look at this. The 2x minus 3 and 2x minus 3 can get factored out. What's left over? Negative 5x squared plus 4. And you're done. Well, hope that helps. We'll practice more in class. Good luck on your assignment. We'll talk to you next time.